Hello, y'all. It's me. It's Dr. G, and welcome back to Star-Spangled Studies. The last time we plunged into the market revolution, the growth of canals and factories and cotton gins that utterly transformed the American economy and the way that people lived and worked. It was an era of incredible growth and boundless ambition, but it also carved deep new divisions in the nation, between North and South, between rich and poor, free and enslaved. This new dynamic, often chaotic America needed a new kind of politics. The old world of the Founding Fathers, where gentlemen governed with a certain aristocratic distance, was dying, if not dead. A new, more boisterous, more aggressive, a more democratic spirit was rising from the farms and the workshops of the nation. One man, more than any other, came to embody this new age. A man born in a log cabin on the Carolina frontier, was orphaned by the Revolution, a celebrated Indian fighter and a hero of the Battle of New Orleans. A man whose life was defined by a fierce, unyielding, and often violent code of honor. On May 30th, 1806, this man, Andrew Jackson, stood on a dueling ground in Kentucky. He took a bullet in the chest that lodged just shy of his heart, but he remained standing. Bleeding, he slowly steadied his pistol, took aim, and mortally wounded his opponent. That same tenacity, toughness, and vengefulness would carry him one day to the White House. To his supporters, he was Old Hickory, the champion of the common man against the corrupt elite. To his enemies, he was King Andrew, a dangerous demagogue, trampling on the Constitution. Today we were going to dive into the age of Jackson, and we'll explore the raucous rise of mass democracy, the brutal policy of what has been called Indian removal, and the epic war of Jackson versus the Bank of the United States, and the constitutional crisis that nearly tore the nation apart. So, was Andrew Jackson the people's president or a petty tyrant? Let's find out. Let's go. Today, we take democracy for granted, but for many of the Founding Fathers, it was a dirty word. They had created a republic, not a democracy, and they were deeply suspicious of what Alexander Hamilton called the vices of democracy. The Philadelphia physician Benjamin Rush warned that the revolution had unleashed a wave of popular rebelliousness that could lead to a new kind of despotism. Quote, "In our opposition to monarchy," he wrote, "we forgot that the temple of tyranny has two doors." End quote. By the 1820s, something in the nation had changed. The old property qualifications for voting were disappearing, at least for white men. Politics was no longer just for the elite. It was becoming a mass spectacle of rallies and parades and partisan newspapers. This was the dawn of the era of the common man, as historians call it, a time when, as one historian puts it, political leaders could no longer afford to overlook, quote, "the cultivation of popular favor." This new democratic spirit found its first major flashpoint in the Missouri crisis of 1819 and 1820. When Missouri applied for statehood, it threatened to upset the delicate balance of power between free and slave states which had equal representation in the Senate. The debate over Missouri was fierce. Congressman James Talmadge of New York proposed an amendment to ban the further introduction of enslaved people into Missouri and to free the children of those already at age 25, arguing that slavery mocked the Declaration of Independence promise of liberty to all men. The crisis eventually was averted, and this was done by the Missouri Compromise, which admitted Missouri as a slave state only because at the last minute, Maine became a state as well, being carved out of Massachusetts as a free state. The compromise also drew a line across the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase at the latitude 3630, and it prohibited slavery north of that Missouri line. It was a temporary fix, but as Thomas Jefferson wrote at the time, it was, quote, "a fire bell in the night" that awakened the nation to the terrifying possibility of disunion over slavery. As Jefferson himself said, "We have the wolf by the ears. We can neither hold it nor let it go." The political forces unleashed by the Missouri Compromise and the fierce battles over it meant that future elections would also be very, very contentious. The election of 1824 was one of these. It was chaotic, it was bitter, and it truly broke the old political order. The Democratic Republican Party had fractured into four regional candidates: Andrew Jackson of Tennessee, the military hero, the legend from the Battle of New Orleans; John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts, the brilliant but aloof Secretary of State; William H. Crawford of Georgia, he was the establishment choice; and Henry Clay of Kentucky, the charismatic Speaker of the House. Jackson won the popular votes and the most electoral votes, but no candidate won an outright majority. As per the Constitution, the election was then thrown into the House of Representatives, where each state delegation would get one vote. Henry Clay, who had come in fourth and was thus really just out of the running, was now the kingmaker. Clay despised Andrew Jackson. He thought he was a dangerous military man, a chieftain in his own words, who was unfit for the presidency. So he threw his support behind John Quincy Adams. Adams then wins the presidency in the House of Representatives. And then just days later, President-elect Adams names none other than Henry Clay to be his Secretary of State, the most prestigious cabinet post and the traditional stepping stone to become the president. Jackson and his supporters were enraged by this nomination. They immediately cried foul. They branded this deal a corrupt bargain. And that's how we picture and know the election of 1824 today, as the election of the corrupt bargain. Jackson's fury was palpable, and he wrote a letter to his friend William Berkeley Lewis just after the news broke. Quote, "So you see, the Judas of the West has closed the contract and will receive the 30 pieces of silver. His end will be the same. Was there ever witnessed such a bare-faced corruption in any country before?" End quote. The charge of corruption would then haunt the Adams presidency and fuel Jackson's campaign over the next 4 years. And that's what Jackson did. He campaigned for the presidency for the next 4 years. The election of 1828 was a vicious rematch. It was a campaign of mudslinging, there was character assassination, and Jackson supporters painted Adams as the corrupt aristocrat. And Adams supporters painted Jackson as a murderous, uneducated backwoodsman. But by this time, the common man had his revenge. Jackson won in 1828 in a landslide, and his inauguration in 1829 was unlike anything Washington had ever seen before. A huge, rowdy crowd of his supporters descended on the White House, tracking mud on the carpets, breaking furniture in their celebration of their hero, Andrew Jackson. To the old guard, it was the, quote, "reign of King Mob," end quote. To Jackson and his supporters, though, it was the dawn of a new democratic age. Jackson's presidency began with a social scandal that had major political consequences. His Secretary of War, John Eaton, had married a woman named Peggy O'Neill Timberlake, a woman of humble origins, but had a reputation for being a tad bit flirtatious. The other cabinet wives, led by Floride Calhoun, the wife of then Vice President John C. Calhoun, snubbed Peggy Eaton, refusing to socialize with her. This is what we call the petticoat affair, and it infuriated Andrew Jackson. He saw this as a parallel between the attacks on Peggy Eaton and the vicious slanders against his own late wife, Rachel, during the 1828 campaign. He defended Peggy, declaring, quote, "I had rather live vermin on my back than the tongue of one of these Washington women on my reputation," end quote. The scandal paralyzed his official cabinet. Jackson increasingly turned for advice to an informal group of friends and newspaper editors, not his traditional cabinet. And this group of friends became known as his kitchen cabinet. The affair also drove a wedge between Jackson and his vice president, John C. Calhoun, and elevated the standing of Secretary of State Martin Van Buren, a widower himself who had shrewdly sided with the Eatons in the whole petticoat affair. This personal drama would soon merge with a much larger constitutional crisis. So in 1828, a crisis erupted over, of all things, tariffs. Congress passed a high protective tariff that Southerners, who relied on imported goods, dubbed the Tariff of Abominations. They argued that it favored Northern manufacturing at the expense of the South. In response, John C. Calhoun, drawing on the precedent of Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that we talked about in a previous episode, anonymously authored a paper called, quote, "South Carolina Exposition and Protest." In it, he laid out the doctrine of nullification, the idea that a state had a right to declare a federal law unconstitutional and therefore null and void within the borders of that state. Quote, "We then hold it unquestionable that on the separation from the Crown of Great Britain, the people of the several colonies became free and independent states. We also hold it as equally questionable that the Constitution of the United States is a compact between the people of the several states, and that the government it created was formed and appointed to execute the powers which the states had delegated to it," end quote. Calhoun argued that the tariff was just the pretext. His real fear was that the power of a federal government was going to expand and then be dominated by a northern majority. And that northern majority might one day come after, you guessed it, slavery. He wrote that the tariff was, quote, "of vastly inferior importance to the great question to which it has given rise, the right of a state to interpose in the last resort in order to arrest an unconstitutional act of the general government," end quote. The debate came to the head on the floor of the U.S. Senate in 1830, in a legendary exchange between Senator Robert Hayne of South Carolina and Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts. Hayne defended nullification. Webster responded with one of the most famous speeches in American history, a powerful defense of the Union. Quote, "I have not allowed myself, sir, to look beyond the Union to see what might lie hidden in the dark recess behind. I have not coolly weighed the chances of preserving liberty when the bonds that unite us shall be broken. While the Union lasts, we have high, exciting, gratifying prospects spread out before us, and for us and our children. Beyond that, I seek not to penetrate the veil. God grant that in my day at least that curtain may not rise. When my eyes shall be turned to behold for the last time the sun in heaven, may I not see him shining on the broken and dishonored fragments of a once glorious union. Let their last feeble and lingering glance rather behold the gorgeous ensign of the Republic, bearing for its motto that other sentiment dear to every true American heart, liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable." End quote. In 1832, South Carolina passed an ordinance of nullification declaring the tariffs of 1828 and 1832 null and void, and threatened to secede from the Union if the government tried to collect the tariffs by force. Jackson was furious, to say the least. His response was swift. He issued a proclamation to the people of South Carolina denouncing the nullification and as a, quote, impractical absurdity, and he said that it was a direct threat to the Union. Quote, I consider then the power to annul a law of the United States assumed by one state incompatible with the existence of the Union, contradicted expressly by the letter of the Constitution, unauthorized by its spirit, inconsistent with every principle on which it was founded, and destructive of the great object for which it was formed. To say that any state may at pleasure secede from the Union is to say that the United States is not a nation. Disunion by armed force is treason. Are you really ready to incur its guilt? End quote. Jackson prepared to use military force, but at the same time, a compromised tariff engineered by Henry Clay was passed, lowering the duties over time. South Carolina backed down, and overall the crisis was averted, but the fundamental questions about states' rights and the nature of the Union remained, simmering just below the surface. If the Nullification crisis was a battle over states' rights, and in more ways than one, a battle over slavery, the Bank War was a battle over economic power and the soul of American capitalism. The Second Bank of the United States was chartered in 1816, and it was a powerful private corporation that acted as the federal government's financial agent. Its president, the brilliant but very arrogant man named Nicholas Biddle, wielded immense power over the nation's economy. To Jackson, the bank and Biddle were monsters. He called them, quote, a hydra of corruption. And they concentrated too much power in the hands of the wealthy, the unelected elite, and it favored northern merchants over southern and western farmers. When the bank came up to be rechartered in 1832, Jackson vetoed it, and he laid out it in a populist sort of cause. Quote, it is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. Every monopoly and all excessive privileges are granted at the expense of the public, which ought to receive a fair equivalent. Many of our rich men have not been content with equal protection and equal benefits, but have besought us to make them richer by act of Congress. By attempting to gratify their desires, we have in the results of our legislation arrayed section against section, interest against interest, and man against man in a fearful commotion that threatens to shake the foundations of our Union. End quote. Jackson's veto was a political masterstroke. It framed the issue as a battle between common people and the corrupt moneyed interests. The Bank War became a central issue of the 1832 election, which Jackson again won in a landslide. He saw his second victory as a mandate to destroy the bank itself. He ordered the removal of federal deposits from the bank and placed them in state-chartered, what he called pet banks. Biddle retaliated by contracting credit, causing a brief financial panic, but it was too late. By this point, the bank was dead. The Bank War had profound consequences for the future. It led to the formation of a new political party, the Whigs, who coalesced around their opposition to King Andrew. The Whigs were led by Henry Clay, and they championed his American system of a national bank, protective tariffs, and federally funded internal improvements. More importantly, the destruction of the bank also contributed to the wild speculation and financial instability that led to the devastating Panic of 1837, which crippled the economy for years. For all the talk of the common man, Jacksonian democracy had sharp, brutal limits. It was a democracy for white men only. And nowhere was this clearer than in Jackson's policy towards Native Americans. For decades, the 5 civilized tribes of the Southeast, these included the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, had adopted many aspects of American culture. They created written languages, they adopted constitutions, and became successful farmers and planters. The Cherokee, in particular, had made remarkable strides. As their leader, Elias Boudinot, described in 1826, quote, "The rise of these people in their movement towards civilization may be traced as far back as the first settlement of the whites among them. Game has since become so scarce that little dependence for subsistence can be placed upon it. They have gradually, and I could almost say universally, forsaken their ancient employment. In fact, there is not a single family in the nation that can be said to subsist on the slender support which the wilderness could afford." Despite the major successes of the Cherokee people, there was no protection against the relentless pressure of land-hungry white settlers, especially when the state was against them. Gold had been discovered on Cherokee lands in Georgia. The state of Georgia passed laws stripping the Cherokee of their rights and claimed their land. The Cherokee fought back, not with weapons, but in the courts. In fact, in two landmark cases, the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831 and Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, the Supreme Court, under Chief Justice John Marshall, sided with the Cherokee, ruling that they were a, quote, "distinct political entity," and that Georgia laws had no force in their territory. Jackson's response was open defiance. He reportedly said, quote, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it," end quote. He refused to protect the Cherokee and instead pushed through Congress the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which authorized the federal government to forcibly remove the southeastern tribes to territories west of the Mississippi. In his address to Congress, Jackson framed this brutal policy as an act of humanitarianism. Quote, "It will separate the Indians from immediate contact with settlements of whites, free them from the power of the states, enable them to pursue happiness in their own way and under their own rude institutions, and perhaps cause them gradually, under the protection of the government and through the influence of good counsels, to cast off their savage habits and become an interesting, civilized, and Christian community," end quote. The Cherokee, under their principal chief John Ross, continued to resist. In an 1836 letter to Congress, Ross pleaded for justice, appealing to the very principle the Americans claimed to cherish, but in this case had trampled on. Quote, "By the stipulations of this instrument, we are despoiled of our private possessions. We are stripped of every attribute of freedom. We are denationalized. We are disenfranchised. We are deprived of membership in the human family. Our hearts are sickened. In truth, our cause is your own. It is the cause of liberty and of justice. It is based upon your own principles, which we have learned from yourselves. For we have gloried to court your Washington and your Jefferson, our great teachers," end quote. Their pleas were ignored. In 1838, the U.S. Army began the forced removal. The journey became known as the Trail of Tears. It was a death march. A private soldier named John G. Burnett, who served as an interpreter, recalled the horror. Quote, "I saw the helpless Cherokees arrested and dragged from their homes and driven at the bayonet point into the stockades. I saw them loaded like cattle or sheep into 645 wagons and started toward the west. On the morning of November 17th, we encountered a terrific sleet and snowstorm with freezing temperatures, and from that day until we reached the end of the fateful journey on March the 26th, 1839, the sufferings of the Cherokees were awful. The trail of the exiles was a trail of death. They had to sleep in the wagons and on the ground without fire. And I have known as many as 22 of them die in one night of pneumonia due to ill treatment, cold, and exposure." End quote. Of the 16,000 Cherokee who were forced to march, over 4,000 died. The policy of Indian removal stands as one of the darkest chapters in American history. It is a brutal testament to the racial limits of Jacksonian democracy. The backlash against King Andrew and his policies led to the formation of a new political party, the Whigs. The Whigs were a diverse coalition of former national Republicans anti-Masons, and disaffected Democrats, all united by their opposition to Jackson. Led by figures like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, the Whigs championed Clay's American system, a strong national bank, protective tariffs, and federally funded internal improvements. They believed in an active government that would promote economic growth and moral progress. After Jackson's hand-picked successor, Martin Van Buren, was blamed for the devastating Panic of 1837, the Whigs saw their chance. In the election of 1840, they beat the Democrats at their own game. They nominated William Henry Harrison, the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe, and they ran a brilliant populist campaign. They portrayed Harrison, who was actually a wealthy Virginia planter, as a humble, cider-sipping, log cabin-dwelling frontiersman. Their slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too, Tippecanoe being Harrison and Tyler being his vice president, and it became one of the most famous in American history. The log cabin and cider campaign, as we call it, was a triumph of image over substance, and Harrison won in a landslide. But the Whig victory was short-lived. Just 1 month after his inauguration, Harrison died of pneumonia. His vice president, John Tyler, a former Democrat who had been put on the ticket to attract Southern voters, ascended to the presidency. Tyler himself was a staunch states' rights advocate, and he promptly vetoed the Whigs' entire legislative program, including their bills to recharter a national bank. This threw the Whig Party into disarray, and a deep sectional division that would now eventually tear the nation apart once again came to the forefront. So this age of Jackson was a period of profound transformation, but it was also very violent. It was an era that saw the expansion of political democracy for white men, but it was also a populist uprising against the perceived power of the moneyed aristocracy, the creation of a stable two-party system that we have to this day. But it was also an era of deep contradictions. The champion of the common man was also a wealthy slave owner who presided over the brutal dispossession of Native American lands. The celebration of liberty for some was built on the denial, once again, of liberty for others. The political battles of this era over the Second American Bank, the tariff, the proper role of the federal government were, at their core, battles again over the very meaning of the American Republic. And as the nation pushed westward, these conflicts would only intensify. The market revolution had created a dynamic, interconnected economy, but one that was increasingly divided into the free labor North and a slave labor South. The next great chapter in our story will be about the collision of these two systems, a collision fueled by a powerful new ideology, manifest destiny. The next time we get together on Star-Spangled Studies, we're going to explore the religious and the reform movements that swept the nation in this antebellum period. Antebellum meaning between the wars. We'll meet the abolitionists, the feminists, the utopian dreamers who sought to perfect American society, even as the nation hurtled towards its greatest crisis. I'm Dr. G, and I'll see y'all in the past.